are so glad that you have decided to join us on Zoom. If this is your first time, thank you so much for being here. We, as a church, like to partner with organizations in our community that are already doing a great work. And this month, our partner is Samaritan's Purse. They are located, they're headquartered in Boone, North Carolina, and they actually do work all across the nation, but they are working right now a whole lot with the hurricane situation in Louisiana. They are helping clean up all the devastation from the hurricanes that passed through last month. And so we are partnering with Samaritan's Purse this month as our monthly partner. And one of the things that we do just to make a difference in the community around us is we donate $10 on behalf of every person who visits for the first time. So if you were here today with us for the first time, we are going to be making a donation in your honor so that we can kind of help those people who have experienced some of that devastation from those storms that passed through in Louisiana and all of the other great work that Samaritan's Purse does. So thank you for being here today. For those of you who contribute financially, thank you for partnering with us so that we can continue. Our church's mission is to influence people to life-giving connections with Jesus, their family, and the community. And because you give, we are able to do things like that, partner with these community organizations, have the family ministries that we have, and do some of the other amazing things that we're able to do because of your generosity. So thank you for doing that. I want to let you know a couple of things. We are having an in-person baptism service next week. So in our in-person services, I think there are 5 people that have decided that they want to make their faith in Jesus public, and they are going to be baptized in our service next Sunday. And we are really excited about that. If this is a step that you are interested in taking, definitely reach out, and we would love to get you on board with that as well. And then on September 13th, that's next Monday, we are starting a parenting group. We'll be meeting on Zoom from 7 to 8:30 for 7 weeks. And we are going to be going through the book, Are My Kids on Track? And that is just a question that all parents ask at some point. One point or another, we're all asking, are our kids on track? And so we're going to dive into some amazing content for 7 weeks, have some good conversations together. So you don't need to sign up. We'll have a Zoom link that will be public. And somebody, if you know people who could benefit from this kind of study, they don't have to be part of Connection Valley in order to be part of this parenting group. So definitely invite them, let them know that it's available. Today, we are in the last week of the Better Way series, and we're going to be talking about the storms of life, and I'm really excited about what Brian has to bring. So I'm going to hand it over to Jim so that he can lead us in some singing, and we invite you to participate with us.
Peace, unending Great way to start this morning. I want to say, unless you've been living under a rock the last week, you've probably heard of a storm named Ida. And the storm actually hit 16 years, 16 years ago. Hurricane Katrina hit on the same day that Hurricane Ida hit this past Sunday. And the reason I bring all that up is it just brought back a lot of memories. And some of you, maybe you don't remember that storm, maybe you do very vividly. And I do because, well, a couple of reasons. It was all over the news. Hurricane Ida's been all over the news. And there's been lots of devastation that we saw happen with Hurricane Ida this past week, still happening with Hurricane Ida, even up into New Jersey and on the eastern coast. But then also with Hurricane Katrina 16 years ago, it really just brought back those memories, because I didn't just see it on the news. I actually went down to Mississippi and Louisiana to do hurricane disaster relief. And one of the things we did 9 months after the storm hit in August of 2000, I guess it was 2005, we went down in April. And so about 9 months later, give or take, we took down a big trailer of food. And we took down this trailer of food to help provide some support to people in a town called Pass Christian, Mississippi. And that the town, when we drove into it, I was just like blown away, because there are trees down. There are stores just completely closed, houses still obliterated, FEMA trailers everywhere, porta johns. It was just like a disaster area. And it was 9 months later. And I couldn't believe it. I'm like, it's like the hurricane just happened. And so we take this big trailer of food, me not really thinking it would make that big of a difference. And we drive it over to a local elementary school to say to the teachers, hey, we know you've had some hardships happen in the last year that we can't even fathom. We want to provide some food that maybe you haven't had access to for the last 9 months. And it was eye-opening to watch these teachers come on the trailer and in tears express their gratitude as they took different food items off the trailer. But there was one item that seemed to really capture people's, I don't know, attention or their desire. They saw this item, they're like, oh my gosh, you have those? And they started like bringing their friends. They started like inviting their friends to come over to see if they could get some of those things that we had on the trailer. And you might be, well, you're probably not going to be surprised, but this is what they were looking this is what they discovered, and they got so excited about it. Was the Oreos. Oreos were like gold, and really put things into perspective for me, because when we experience hardship, we see things in a different way. When we experience storms, we see things in a different way. And I started thinking about how when we enter into the storms of other people, we see life differently. And so today we're going to talk about life storms and how to be storm ready. And I started thinking about what are life storms we all experience. At our in-person service this morning, I listed 5 things that we're all going to experience in life. And I would call these things storms. The first one being the death of a loved one. I asked the people at our in-person service, I said, how many of you have ever experienced the death of a loved one? I said, just raise your hand. Oh, everyone raised their hand. And it was very apparent in that moment, and it's very apparent just knowing you guys and knowing your stories, that you understand what that's like. You understand the storm that brings. You understand the feelings, the thoughts, and emotions, and it can feel very heavy at times. We also understand the storm of financial setbacks. If you've ever lost a job before, if you've ever been laid off, if you've ever had like an unexpected car or home repair that maybe you weren't prepared to pay for, that can be a storm, and the pressure that creates can be enormous. And sometimes the damage that can cause in our lives can be very hurtful. There's also health issues. I don't know that I can remember a time in our lives where health has been so front and center with this last year and a half, where I've seen so many people scared and panicked and worried about their future based on the health storm that they've experienced or loved ones experienced because of COVID. So we understand what that's like, and that storm. Also, there's family dysfunction. And if you want to know like how dysfunctional your family is, just go to a family reunion, right? You've been to one of those before? You're like, I'm related to you? Oh no. You're in my bloodline. Some of you understand exactly what I'm talking about. You got that uncle with 3 teeth, and it's like, whoa, what happened here? But in all seriousness, every family has dysfunction. And I look back and I look at my current family, and I look back at the family I grew up in. And while some of the storms weren't huge, some of them at times have been big because of our own dysfunction. And then last, but certainly not least, when we lose a relationship that ends painfully, a relationship with a loved one, a relationship with a good friend, and it's somebody you used to know and you used to really be good friends maybe. And now it's just like a memory. It's not something that you're currently enjoying or able to enjoy because something happened. And you may not even be completely sure what happened in that relationship or that friendship. But that's the reality you're dealing with right now. And that is a storm that can cause or create havoc and cause devastation. And so we're going to talk today about how to be storm ready. And if you haven't been with us, Brooke mentioned earlier, we're in week 6 of the Better Way series. And so we've been looking at teaching from Jesus, which is transformational. I mean, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, it's like, wow, he taught some incredible stuff, but he also taught some very hard stuff. His content sometimes is like, I don't think I'm going to do that, because a lot of people, when they heard him speak, they would be like, wow, this is amazing teaching. But then they would walk away unchanged because what he was asking sometimes felt too challenging and too difficult. And when he was doing the teaching we're going to talk about today, as we've mentioned in the prior weeks, he had a huge crowd of people. And the sermon we're speaking from today, or the message we're speaking from today that he gave, is known as the Sermon on the Mount. So he's on a hill in northern Jerusalem, and there's a crowd. There's a whole bunch of people from all kinds of different walks of life, from financially different status levels, religious leaders, you had politicians, you had people from all walks of life, people who would be looked down on like prostitutes and tax collectors, and people who would be considered sinners. And so it was just a really diverse crowd that day. But here's the thing. When people heard him teach, they were amazed. They went, how is this guy able to teach like this? I mean, he hasn't even been to school, but he blew them away with the insight of his teaching. And it says in Matthew chapter 7, Matthew, who was an eyewitness and follower of Jesus, wrote about this sermon. He wrote it down because he was there to hear it that day. But he wrote these words about the sermon when Jesus was finished. In verse 28 and 29 of Matthew chapter 7, he said, when Jesus had finished saying these things, basically the messages from the Sermon on the Mount, which you can be found in the Bible in Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7, when Jesus said these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. And what we know about Jesus and looking at the teaching then, and even for now, is that his teaching just wasn't good for then. It's also good for now. And the story we're going to look at today, or not really the story, I should say, the part of the sermon we're going to look at today is from Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. I'm going to read this part of the sermon for you, and then I'm going to go through and break it down. Jesus said, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had a foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. So verse 24, when he introduces this part of his teaching, the first word he uses is therefore. And anytime we see the word therefore, as I've mentioned previously, we have to ask, what is the therefore? Because what we know is when he says the word therefore, he's referencing prior teaching. And in this case, he's referencing that entire sermon. So therefore, because of what he has previously said, what he has said to the crowd that day, and what he's saying to us today, he said, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Hears these words of mine basically means to understand and perceive what's being said. So these large crowds are hearing, everyone there is hearing, they're understanding on some level, and they're perceiving what Jesus has to say. He says, anyone who hears these words and puts them into practice, what does it mean to put into practice? It means to do in the present, to do in an ongoing matter. Sometimes it means to complete something. But anyone who hears the words of Jesus and puts them into practice is like a wise man. Well, what does it mean to be wise? Well, another word for wise is prudent. We've talked about prudence in the past, but being prudent is to carefully consider the future, to look ahead, to be long-term minded, to not be just about the short term and the immediate gain. And so he said, anyone who puts these words into practice is a wise man or a wise woman. And we all know plenty of people who are wise. We know people who are unwise. One of the things I've heard in the past from other pastors is to ask this kind of question when you're considering wise choices and when you're trying to make a decision on something where you're unsure if it's right or wrong or what you should actually do. But this is a great question when you're at this crossroad. And the question goes like this: what is the next wise step for me in light of my past experiences, my current situation, and my desired future? I'm going to say that one more time. What is a wise next step for me in light of my past experiences, my current situation, and my desired future? Because what I know about you and what I know about me is we all have a desired future. We have a place where we want our lives to go. Yet so often I see people not actually get to that desired future because of the choices they make. And so what Jesus is saying is, when it comes to being wise, is when you look at your past, what could you learn from your successes and failures? We can take good out of bad all the time when we learn from our failures. When you look at your present, what is God currently teaching you? What do you sense him saying? And then when you look at your future, what would you want that to be like? What would you want that to look like? What kind of story do you want to tell with your life to where when you get to the end of it, people look at that and go, wow, I want to follow that kind of legacy. That's something I think we all want, even though we don't always think about it in the moment. It's something we all want. Which is one of the reasons why we have to keep our future and our future hopes and our future dreams in front of us, because it's so easy to drift away from thinking about those things, but it's what keeps us making wise choices. So tangibly speaking, this may be how it works for certain people. Like, for instance, if you struggle with substance abuse and you've got friends you want to hang out with, but you know that they're going to be at a party and they're going to get blitzed and they're going to get bombed and they're going to get drunk or they're going to get high, and you struggle with substance abuse, you probably don't need to hang out with them in that context. Now, I've heard people before say, man, I just want to be an influence, man. I just want to be an influence. But if you struggle with substance abuse, hanging out in that situation isn't going to take you where you want to go. And so saying, you know what, maybe a wise thing to do would be able to still hang out with these people in the context where these things are happening that are going to pull me potentially in to what I've been struggling with in the past. So maybe I go to dinner with them, or maybe I have coffee with them. That's considering the future as you think about the past and the present. Or maybe it's this: you struggle with credit card debt. Well, one of the first things you probably need to do is break out the scissors and cut it up. You can live without credit cards. But if you struggle with credit card debt, you probably don't want to go to a place where they have a bunch of items that are out of your budget that you find yourself wanting and desiring. The more you spend time in that store or online, at that store online, you're going to find yourself wanting to hear the buy button or push the purchase button. It's so easy to do, especially when it's just like one click away. So it may be that you need to pull yourself out of those situations in order for you to be able to live out being wise. Or maybe you struggle with what you look at, and maybe you struggle with lust. And I've talked about this with the next generation quite often. If you have a phone or if you have a computer and you struggle with lust, to go in your bedroom by yourself and to close the door when so much is readily accessible by you just opening up your phone or opening up your laptop. Well, you may want to reconsider that decision because it's not going to take you where you want to go. Is it wrong for you to go in your room by yourself with your phone or your laptop? Absolutely not. But is it wise, considering the struggle you may have, to do that? And if we're really being honest with ourselves and we're asking ourselves, hey, what's happened in the past, what's happening in the present, and where do I want to go in the future? We consider this question of what is a wise next step in light of all those things. So Jesus is writing about, if you put my words into practice in the present, you're like a wise man or a wise woman who built their house on a rock. And what does it mean to build your house or to build your life essentially on a rock? It means to build your life on something that's immovable, something that is secure, something that is safe, something that can withhold or support you in the middle of a storm. And he speaks to this in verse 25 by saying, the rain came down on this house built on the rock, and the streams rose and the winds blew. And we can close our eyes and we can think about video we've seen from like hurricane footage, and we can see the rain and we can see the floods and we can see the wind. Maybe you've experienced it firsthand before. And it beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on a rock. And so Jesus talks about this wise man and says, when you see and you hear what I'm saying and you do it with an ongoing action, you will be wise. You will have a firm foundation in the middle of any storm, because here's the reality we talked about earlier. We're all going to face storms. Now, he continues in verse 26 by talking about a contrasting person, the foolish man. And he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. What does it mean to not put the words into practice? Well, if you're a parent, you understand this idea. If you've ever had a child, you understand what it's like to speak words that they hear and understand that they reject, right? I mean, why is a toddler's favorite word no, 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 no? If you're a parent or a grandparent, you understand this. It can be maddening at times. But this is what he's talking about. You hear, but you don't do. Now, I can also say that our kids would look at our lives sometimes and say, well, my parents said they were going to do this, but they didn't do it. It kind of can go both ways. And being both a son and being a father, I understand this dynamic. But the person who hears the words and doesn't put them into action, Jesus says, is a fool or being foolish. And the word he uses here, it's a Greek word, was moros. Moros means to be what? A moron. Now, I think moron is kind of a funny sounding word, like that guy's a moron. You've heard people probably use that phraseology again. It just sounds kind of funny, but what it literally means is to be mentally dull. It's like it's not connecting on what you need to be doing. And so the person that doesn't put the words of Jesus into action is like a moron or mentally dull. And they're like building their house on a shaky, shifting foundation of sand. I was reading recently a devotional by a pastor named Tim Keller, and he wrote this about what it means to be foolish. He said, the ultimate foolishness is to make anything the center of our lives besides God. That will always lead to disappointment and breakdown. Catch this, because this right here is so good, because we see it happening all around us, and it may be you. Fools fail to see the boundaries embedded in reality: physical, psychological, relational, and spiritual. They step outside of these boundaries and they wonder why they sink. Have you seen this play out in someone's life before? Like they've made a series of foolish choices, and then it's like They act surprised, like, my life is falling apart. And it's like, you don't want to be cruel and you don't want to be hard-hearted, but it's like, but all these choices you made back here have led you to the destination that this plus this plus this equals. And a fool oftentimes acts surprised. They get mad and they blame God. They're like, why me? Why did you do this to me? It's interesting that even years before Jesus spoke these words, King David, who was a famous king from Israel, said these words about a fool. And he said, a fool has said in his heart, there is no God. In other words, a fool says, I'm going to assert myself as the God of my life. But what you and I both know is we're all fallible human beings. We all have fallen short of God's glory. We've all done things known as sin. We've done things that we look back on and go, I wish I didn't do that. I wish I didn't say that. And we can't do life on our own the way we want to do it without the involvement and intervention of God. He's the one that takes our life and makes it amazing and brings beauty out of brokenness. But a fool says, I sit on the throne of my life. I'm in control. And Jesus talks about what happens to a person that ignores the words of Jesus and they build their life on sand. He says, the rain came down on this house or this life, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. The word here, great crash, literally means fell, F-E-L-L, or failed. Now, it's not like a country way to say fell with an ED on the end. It's F-A-I-L-E-D. In other words, failure. A life built on sand that ignores the words of Jesus and says, I'm going to be God. I'm going to be the center of the universe, is a life destined for failure and destined for a great crash. The thing that we see that's vividly different between the wise builder and the foolish builder is one said, you know what, I can do it my own way, while the other one said, I'm dependent, I'm needy. And that's the posture we have to approach God with, is that I need you. Jesus is like, I'm giving you my words, I'm giving you my life. But oftentimes people reject it, thinking that their way is better than his way. James, the brother of Jesus, wrote this about not just hearing, but then actually doing. In James 1:22, he says, don't merely listen to the word and so trick yourselves or deceive yourselves, do what it says. And oftentimes people hear the words of Jesus, they get excited about what they've heard, and yet it falls short when it comes to action. But faith without action, as James writes about, is actually dead. Now, do my actions make me right with God? Absolutely not. We can't make ourselves right with God, but he made us right with him by what Jesus did by dying for us on the cross, by Jesus sacrificing his life for you and me. But when we receive that by faith, it's then that our actions follow because of what he's done for us. It all begins with him, but then it's a faith that leads to action. And in other words, when it comes to the better way doesn't just hear, doesn't just take it in, but then actually does and puts it into action. So I have a couple questions I want you to think about as we land our time. And the first one is this: on what foundation are you building your life? Would you say you're building your life on something that's solid, that's immovable, that's secure? Or would you say that you're building your life on something that is destined for a great crash, that's destined for failure? Another question I want you to consider is, what is your response to the teaching of Jesus? We all have a choice. We can say, yeah, I'm not in a place where I'm worthy of being God or being God in my life. I'm going to receive it or I'm going to reject it. It really comes down to that. It's really that straightforward. And I get it that sometimes we kind of find ourselves in the middle of something. But I tell you what, if you're in the middle right now, you're not exactly sure, go back to that question with whatever decisions you're facing right now is, what is the wise next step for me to take in light of my past experience, my current situation, and my future or desired future? You go back and ask that question, you'll find direction, because we find ourselves being in a firm and secure place, regardless of a storm, when we choose to be wise. A couple of things I want to say about storms that we know are true, but we sometimes forget. Storms are inevitable and unavoidable. They're inevitable and unavoidable. That means they're going to happen. Like I said, the list of 5 things I mentioned earlier before, when it came down to death of a loved one. Well, I can certainly check that. And I remember when my father died on October 25th, 2014, like it was yesterday. I remember being in the hospital room. I remember what it smelled like. I remember the things that were being said. I remember being around my family. We know that storms are going to happen. Storms vary in their severity and length. Some storms last a long time. It's like we see these hurricanes come through, and sometimes it's like they just sit and spin in the same spot and they get kind of stuck, and it seems like, oh wow, this storm is going to be here forever. Or we've had big rain fronts come in here to our great state of North Carolina, and it's just like the clouds park over us and it just rains and rains and rains, and we're like, when is the sun going to come back? Storms are like that sometimes, in that they can be really long. Sometimes they're kind of short. They vary in severity and length. Storms are temporary. Even when they seem like they're lasting forever, they're temporary. And we know that even beyond this life, when we're on the other side, if we put our faith in Jesus and we're in heaven, this storm, whatever we're experiencing, even if it seems to never end, will end. It won't last forever. Storms remind us that we're not in control. Storms actually help us be in a position where we realize our need for God. We realize we're not able to be God. We need him. And then storms reveal our true foundation. When you see people's responses to a storm, you learn a lot about their faith and what their faith is in, whether their faith is in themselves, their faith is in having circumstances a certain way, or maybe their faith is in Jesus. So considering those realities of what storms are, I want you to go back to those 2 questions I posed just a few moments ago. On what foundation are you building your life? Something solid or something that's destined for a great crash? And as you think about that, I want you to think about some steps that maybe you can take today. And the first one would be that you could put your faith and trust in Christ alone. Because a lot of us, we maybe know the talk. We've heard people talk about what this means, but basically it means saying to God, you know what? You provided Jesus to pay the price for my sin, and I want to receive you, and I want to place my faith in you, not in myself, to save me from my sin and to help me to have a life worth living now, and then ultimately experiencing eternal life with you forever. But that's when we put our faith and confidence in Jesus alone, that we receive that. The second step may be, you know what? You maybe need to reconsider your choices. Just making wise choices. To say, I've been making choices that are taking me to a destination where I don't want to go. I don't like where this road ends. And so maybe it's today taking a step back and going back to that question I've posed is, what is a wise next step in light of my past experience, my current situation, and my desired future? Maybe your next step today is to be courageous and enter into someone else's storm. Sometimes we just don't want to get messy. Am I right? I mean, sometimes it feels like the weight of someone else's storm is just too much. But what happens when we actually enter into the storm of someone else is we become more grateful, we become more thankful, and we start to see that our life actually means something. Even the storms we've experienced mean something, because like I mentioned earlier with my father dying, when someone says they lost their father, I instantly have something in common with them, or maybe in the process of losing somebody close to them. I can understand that, at least from a son to a father standpoint. And so God can take good out of those bad circumstances, or circumstances that we would never choose. A couple more things here. We can also learn from storm survivors. There are people around us that have gone through hardships and storms that we haven't experienced yet, but maybe we'll experience. And if we can learn from them now, we're more storm ready when that storm comes, because we know the storm is coming. And then lastly, we can see storms. When we see storms as an opportunity for maturity, then the storm is not wasted. And so often people are ready to hit fast forward, or they're ready to hit skip on whatever storm they're in, or they're ready to hit the thumbs down on whatever storm they're in. And it's not until that moment that you embrace that storm and say, I'm willing to let you teach me what I need to know, God, so that you can use my life to help other people. That's oftentimes when the maturity comes. And when you take some of these steps, whatever that step may be, you find yourself living a life like this on a rock versus a life that's falling with a great crash. So I want to share with you one other storm story that happened from 2018. A lot of you are familiar with Hurricane Michael that hit the Gulf Coast of Florida in 2018 as a Category 5 hurricane, massive storm, and it wreaked havoc. And there's a place called Mexico Beach that's in the area where the hurricane came in and hit. And there was a picture that went viral shortly after the storm came through. And the picture basically had a bunch of houses that were devastated all over the beach, with the exception of one. And that house that stood through the storm and had that firm foundation had been built in April of that same year, where the storm came in October. And they asked the owners, like, what did you do to make this happen? And they said, well, we spent a little bit more. It took a little bit longer, but we wanted to make sure it had a foundation that could withstand the winds of the strongest hurricane. And because they did, their house stood strong in the middle of the storm. And that's what happens for you and me when we decide, you know what, I'm not going to try to build my life on a foundation that's going to end in failure or a crash, but I'm going to build my life on a foundation that's firm, that's secure, that's immovable. So as you consider what I've been sharing from the teaching of Jesus, I want you to remember this, that the better way hears and then does. Would you join me in prayer? Jesus, we thank you for your teaching that transforms us if we don't just hear it, but we do it. And I pray you would help us take our next faith step, whatever that is today. For those who are with us right now and watching live, for those who attended our in-person service this morning, or for those who are going to be watching later this week, I pray you would use your message to transform lives and that people would begin to step into wisdom. As we sing this next song, I just pray it to be a reminder to build our life on the rock of Jesus. It's in your name we pray. Amen.